here. Glad to be with you, my friends. And we'll start. I'll do the usual screen share so we can all look at the same thing, have the same text in front of us. As always, if y'all want, you're welcome to, at the same time, I know certainly, when he's not in Africa, Lynn will typically have his Bible open as well. We'll just be in that 8th chapter of John.
I've got mine.
There you go.
Now?
It's the Message.
Oh, the Message. Very good.
Right.
All right. So last week we looked at chapter 7, where Jesus' family rejects him, and he goes to Jerusalem for Sukkot, for the Festival of Booths in Judaism. Then there's just a ton of happening after that because it's all that discourse happens, right? There's lots of back and forth, and Jesus is accusing everyone of trying to kill him, which not everyone is, but certainly some of them are after him and trying to. So that's just a quick recap of chapter 7. We aren't really going to look back at it right now because today we have a very interesting part. We have today we have in our story the stoning of the woman, or that is the attempted stoning of the woman. This is a story most Christians know. They don't always know every story out there, but this is one of the more famous ones, where the Pharisees bring a woman to Jesus to stone, and he famously says, of course, "You who is without sin cast the first," right? So we know the broad parameters of it, but we also know, as I mentioned last week, that this story is very clearly a late addition to the Gospel of John. That is, we have some versions, some of our older texts of the Gospel of John don't have this story. It's simply not in there. Somewhere along the line, someone edited, amended, corrected, added the story of the stoning of the woman. It only appears in the Gospel of John, so it's not one that we can say, oh, well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it says this, and in John it says this. It only shows up here. And again, it only shows up as a late addition. So it's a quirky little tale. Scholars get very, very worried about this text since, like I said, there's some early copies that do not have this story in that place. And so they wonder which is the original, which is not. And most people believe that the original version of the Gospel of John is the one without the story, that addendum or a gloss is there. This is really just a full-fledged edit. Someone added the story somewhere there. I understand their concern. Who added this? Why? What does it mean that this wasn't originally in the gospel? Is it historical? These are all questions that people have written lots of articles, scholarly and otherwise, about to try and figure out, like, what happened to this story, right? There's actually a number of places in Scripture that scholars question like this. The Gospel of John has two. One is this story. The other is the 21st chapter of John. Now, this one, these first 10 verses of chapter 8, there's absolutely uniform agreement that this is a later edition. The Gospel of John has a 21st chapter. But at the end of the 20th chapter, there is a whole series of lines that are basically like, all of this was written so that you might believe, and believing in him you might have everlasting life. And it's written in a way that sounds like it's the end of the gospel. Then you have another whole chapter that's the story of Peter on the shore having breakfast with Jesus, right? And then that exact same ending is copied again, almost word for word, and is the actual ending of the gospel. And so while we have not found any of the versions of the Gospel of John that don't have the 21st chapter, scholars are pretty agreed that it got added in there somewhere, somehow. We just don't know exactly when or where because we don't have anything that doesn't have it. That doesn't mean people aren't looking. But, so all that to say, I'm going to take a quick side note just so you can have an idea. These are the technical names for how all this works, for how we look at our texts. That is, before the Enlightenment, really, it's later than that, right? Before the 20th century, when you read a text, you just sort of accepted it for what it was. In the 20th century, we started applying all sorts of analysis to our biblical texts. And there were really four big areas that took off. Okay, so one is called text criticism. That examines what the text and manuscripts originally said or how tweaks and changes evolved, right? So this is a classic text criticism concern in part because there's versions that don't even have this story in it, and there are versions that do have this in it. And so they're literally people who spend all their time and days looking through thousands, hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient texts to figure out exactly where it was. The other thing, and this is the thing I truly love, there's a subsection of text criticism that I just think is fascinating and couldn't probably be more crazy in its own right, but there's a subsection that examines what they call those scribal glosses. That is where, before the printing press, we had scriptoriums, and scriptoriums were nothing more than a group of monks in a room writing the text out. And the way it worked in most of those big scriptoriums was one person would have the Bible open at the front of the room, and that person's job, that monk's job, would be to read the text very slowly while all of the people wrote down what that person said. Okay? So this is a very labor-intensive process, but that's how they basically copied text. So if there was one Bible in all of England, there would be one monk at the front of the room reading that Bible, and there'd be hopefully like 10 or 12 monks very patiently with pen and quill, like with ink and quill in hand, writing the text out. Now what happens is a number of things. If a monk does not read particularly clearly, then that means someone who's listening can write the wrong word down, right? Or, and there have been a handful of cases, they theorize that there might have been a monk with a lisp, and if there was a monk with a lisp, then there might be some extra S's in some of those copies from that. Right? I mean, it's sort of silly and ridiculous, but this is literally the things that they look at. And so they can literally, a lot of these people will do this work so exhaustively that they can tell you not necessarily exactly what day it happened, but they can definitely tell you like, oh, all of the Bibles that were copied from this monastery in Germany all have this incorrect notation because either the text had it wrong or when they were copying it, they all heard it wrong or some variation on that. In some cases, there are also just places where monks get worried because it says something that they don't think is great. One of the classics is there's a couple parts where Jesus gets upset, and so they will change the word from upset to he was worried, right, or something like that. They don't like the idea of Jesus getting angry, so they would add or tweak some of these things because they were trying to sand off maybe some of Jesus's rough edges. All that's part of text criticism, right? Looking at how the text is put together and exactly how it's copied and engaged. Again, it's interesting stuff, but it gets super detailed. The source criticism, this is much bigger in the Old Testament than the New Testament, but it's certainly big in both. It searches for the original sources. If you've ever done any Old Testament research or read anything about this, the classic would be the story of Noah and the flood, right? There are literally dozens of stories in the ancient world. There's an Egyptian tale, there's a Sumerian tale, there's all these tales about an ancient flood that happened. And when source criticism gets going, they will take like the story of Gilgamesh, which is the great legend of a Sumerian hero who survives a flood by building a boat. And they'll say, okay, well, what does this have to say? And what does Noah's version say? And how do these relate? And what's the theological changes and differences between those stories, right? Here's the source text, maybe. Behind it, here's the story behind the story. And then here's how we ended up with it. Okay, so there's text criticism, source criticism, then there's form criticism. This is a sort of quirky subset, and it's hard to describe because it blends into the next one, which is literary criticism. But form criticism is really analyzing the form of what is written and truly trying to figure out, since most of the Bible started as oral tradition, how did it go from that oral tradition to being a written tradition? And it sometimes gets into this idea of, well, maybe this text was written to address a very specific situation, right? If there's a whole story about how the priests of Israel should wear a certain type of clothing, then they're sort of going, well, why do they have to wear a certain type of clothing? What's the whole deal here with this source of clothing? What was the oral tradition, or what was going on that Israel had to address this issue in the first place? And so that's how the sort of form criticism works. But like I said, I'm a little confused with the next, which is literary. Literary criticism then looks at the style of the passage that you're looking at, right? So are we reading poetry? Are we reading prose? Are we reading history? Are we reading propaganda? And what are the author's intents? What did the author intend to do when they wrote this text? And what are the themes in the text? Classic literary criticism kind of approach would be to look at the book of Ruth. I love the book of Ruth, great book. But a literary critic would look at it and say, well, this is clearly government propaganda. And that is, the whole story is about how David's grandmother was a Moabite, and there were rules about how no Israelite was allowed to marry a Moabite. So they will say, well, this is probably at least partially propaganda. They had to talk about how Ruth was a really, really good woman. It was okay for the king of Israel to have a Moabite grandmother, right? Technically, that would preclude him from being king or make his family, his family a scandal. But, oh, Ruth was a great woman, and here's the great thing. So literary criticism does not say that then that story doesn't matter. It's just to say, like, we should read it carefully, knowing that it might be a little bit of a propaganda in there, right? I mean, the same way we would read if you read about Ronald Reagan and it started talking about how he was worked as a lifesaver in high school and he continued to save lives the rest of his career, then we would obviously go, okay, well, this is a certain approach to Ronald Reagan as a politician, and maybe a little bit of propaganda is mixed in there with history, right? We would do that automatically with a modern text. We just don't always do it with ancient texts. All right, I'm putting all of that out there. Those are the main sources. It's also fair to say that there are lots of subsets of these criticism texts. That is, that there are like womanist readings, which is Black women reading the text that have very specific critiques of things that are going on. There are feminist readings, feminist criticism. There is societal criticism. There's all different ways of looking at the text that have gotten much more detailed, but these are sort of the broad approaches to analyzing the text more than necessarily to searching meaning for the text. That said, all four areas go crazy over the text we're talking about today, because we don't know, we know it wasn't original to text, right? We know it was not there, that this story was a later addition. So text criticism, they're very anxious, like, where did this text come from? What happened? Source criticism then is equally concerned about not only where did it come from, but was there a story behind the story? Did this happen in Jesus' life? Where did it come in? Form criticism is wondering if there's something behind, if there's a story behind the story that they're trying to address. Was Jesus criticized for not caring for women? Was there an issue in the early community about adultery and what Jesus would say about adultery? So they had to add this story to address that concern. So form critics are worried about it, and then literary critics are concerned because obviously someone else wrote it if it didn't come in until later. So probably John didn't write it. Is it propaganda? Is it history? Is it theology? What's the whole point of this text? And because it literally just almost dropped in out of nowhere, all four major sources of criticism get really, really anxious about this story.
Is it a statement about the death penalty?
Yeah, it could be about the death penalty, right? It could absolutely be about the death penalty, or the way Israel chose to enforce the death penalty, right? All of these things could be part of that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
But we don't really know, because it's not, there's not a direct moment that says, and this is what this means. Sometimes, like in the Gospel of Luke, he'll literally say, and this is what this means, the reason why it's in the text. That's not here either. So what ends up happening most of the time when you read most Bibles, there will be a big old bracket around this text. There's a bracket at the beginning, bracket at the end, that's very clearly supposed to indicate to you, this is in there, but I don't know what to do with it, right? Or with that sort of idea that there might not be things. The end of the Gospel of Mark is usually the same way, because there are 3 different endings to the book of Mark, because we have found multiple versions of that endings of the Gospel of Mark. And we don't really know how the Gospel of Mark fully ended. Most think it just ends with the women leaving the tomb afraid, is how it ends, and that people didn't like that, so then they later added stories to the end of the Gospel of Mark. And so if you look at the end of the Gospel of Mark, usually there's 2 or 3 little things that are bracketed that say, like, that has the original, what possibly is the original ending, where it says, and the women ran away afraid. And then you have another, like, sort of bracket of 1, 3 or 4 verses, and then there's another bracket after that one, a double bracket of another ending. And so there are these ways that, again, because we don't have the original copies of any of the Gospels, we're always dealing with copies of copies. It's hard to know exactly which ones came in when all the time and where. Usually we just go by age. So if the text, we can prove that one text is older, then we tend to say, well, that's original, and then sort of work backwards. The problem is that doesn't always mean that's true for any text, because it could be, just because it's older doesn't mean it's the original. There could be somebody who edited something out as much as added something in some of those early copies too. So who knows? Who knows? All that to say, after those big 4 criticisms, there's lots of other ways to look at the text, but the one that I like the best is what one of my professors used, which is canonical criticism. That is, we have a canon of Scripture, and so we can talk ourselves blue about any of these areas. How did we get the text? Who wrote the text? Why did they write the text? Where did it come from? All these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it's in our Bible, so we got to deal with it. We can sit there and spin on this textual criticism merry-go-round a lot, and people have. I mean, there are books, literally books, written on just this one passage of Scripture. But at the end of the day, it's in our Bible, so we'll just wrestle with it. And more importantly, it's one that, and this is really where a lot of the scholars that I've seen that I agree with the most agree, and that is, this is probably one of those oral stories about Jesus that was just such a cool story that someone said, we can't lose that story, let's add it to a gospel. That's the sort of broadest idea of how this got in there, which I actually like. I like that idea that this is just one of those stories that they said, we can't lose it, let's make sure it's in there somewhere, and they just sort of someone shoved the story in there to make sure it got preserved.
And it seems to me sort of consistent with, or has the trappings of the other things we know about Jesus are said in the gospel. It seems like it has veracity to me as being somewhat truthful.
Absolutely.
Or historical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you get into the sort of historical Jesus model of those folks who are trying to say who was the original historical person of Jesus versus the dogma that got built up later, it certainly seems like something Jesus would do in that situation, right? Sort of akin to countless other times the Pharisees try to trap Jesus and he figures a clever way out of the situation. So yeah, it definitely, there's part of that too. Before we jump on into the next, because we're going to shift gears pretty heavily, any questions about all these sort of, I just wanted you to have an idea broadly of this idea of criticism and how most of the time when a scholar is writing a book about all of this, they will be writing from one of those approaches, right?
Bill, could there be a connection between what came before and what came after this particular passage?
Yeah, so that's the other great question, Roy, that there's not much that connects it in either direction. We have that moment in chapter 7 where Jesus goes and has the big conversation at Succoth about our faith and our script. You know, he's talking about who he is, and then they disagree and they fight and they're all trying to kill him, and there's these back and forths. But it's really much more of a discourse, right? Well, the verses that come directly after this are more discourse. And it's not like someone dropped in a story in the middle of a speech, but it's not far off. After this, it goes straight back into a discourse that's not related at all to adultery or stoning or any of these other kinds of themes that you might expect from the text, or death penalty or any of that kind of stuff. It just sort of jumps into Jesus saying, I am the light of the world, even though you don't understand me, which is much more akin to the argument he was having with the community gathered in front of him in chapter 7. So yeah, okay. There's part of that people see that only adds fire to the belief that it was maybe dropped in. All right, so all of that in mind, I thought we'd do something a little bit different today. Really, for the Bible study, we've looked more on this technical approach. Without telling you, I've been using literary criticism or source criticism or form criticism, all these kinds of things. We've been engaging some of these stories in this way, talking about like the woman at the well, how that was a story that, from a literary perspective, was a mimic of the courting stories, right? We were doing that same kind of criticism with the Bible and then sort of engaging where we thought of it. I thought for this, because this is such a outside the box story, that we try something a little bit different just to look at the text. So I'm going to invite you into something different, and we'll try it this week and see what y'all think. We can keep doing it, or we can just try it. But I thought we'd try something a little different. This is called the Ignatian Bible Study. Has anybody ever tried an Ignatian Bible study before, done anything like it?
No.
Good, then this will be fun. And it is fun. So here's how it works. I'll give you 3 or 4 things to focus on, and then we'll read the text. Okay, so just here's 2 or 3 questions. The text is a whopping 10 verses long, so it won't take long to read it. But I'll read it slowly so we can think about it, engage it. But we'll read through the text with those 3 or 4 questions in mind. Then I'll wait for a minute or 2 of silence, of reflection and prayer, sort of let you think about that text. Then we'll do it again. Then I'll give you 3 or 4 more things to engage and ways to engage the text, and then we'll read it a second time, right? We'll do that. We'll read that text a second time, and not really, don't worry about answering the questions or having an answer for the group about the questions. These are much more how do you engage the text than, if I ask you the question, who are the major characters, don't worry about like remember that and then tell everybody next. It's more just how do you start to think about the text, right? How do you engage the text? It's an invitation to use your imagination and prayer to be part of the story. So when I give you those questions, it's just here's some entryways to talk about the text at each level, right? So I'll give you 3 or 4 things. We'll read the text. We'll have some silence. And I'll give you 3 or 4 more things, and we'll read the text. We'll have some silence. There's not any response there either. Then I'll give you a few more instructions. We'll read the text a 3rd time. We'll have a little silence and reflection, and then a few more details and instructions, and finally a 4th reading. So we'll read the text 4 times. So we'll have lots of time to hear the details and nuance of the text. I'll give you instructions for different ways to hear. Give you a chance to engage it, just to get out of our analytical, scientific brain and into our hopeful and faithful brain. Those are always oppositional. Give us a chance to engage it that way. And then after a couple of minutes, after that 4th reading, I'll end our prayer with an amen, and we can discuss anything that we heard in the text. Each of us talk a little bit about how we did that. This is, again, from Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. This is the Jesuit form of prayer, the Ignatian form of scripture study. And the whole point really is just to use your imagination to read the story. See what you hear, because sometimes we rush through quickly, like we do even with us this Bible study some weeks, and we miss some of the details because we're pumped trying to get to 75 verses in in 1 hour or something like that. And this is much more reflective, thinking, praying. All right. Any questions? It'll be super. It's not hard. Don't worry about like writing the questions down or remembering all of them. Again, it's just ways. How do we enter into the text? Is the real purpose of this? How do we find ourselves in the story versus being outside the story? All right, we'll give this a shot, my friends. We'll see how this works. So, for our first reading, here are the questions for the first time we go through. Where and when does it happen? The basic setting, where and when does it happen? Who is there? Who is in this story? What happens in this story, right? So the first time through, we're just trying to get the broad ideas, refresh our memory and our feeling about the story. No further ado, I will start reading. Early in the morning, he, that is Jesus, came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Once again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. They heard it. They went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." So we'll take a minute here of just silence to think about what we just read, and then we'll give you some more info and more ideas. A minute can be a long time. So, now we're in the second reading. We hopefully for that first reading, we got a good idea of who those major folks are. Now for the second reading, we'll go a little bit further, right? We'll try and think about some of the details. Who are the major players in this story? And who else is there? There are major players in every story, but who are the minor players? Who are the people around the edges? What are they doing, both the major players and the minor? How do they all interact? What is the setting like? What time of day is it? What is the mood? What is the atmosphere? And there may not be definitive answers for these in the texts, but this is also now gauging our imagination a little, right? Whether we know if it was morning, noon, or night, what time of day do we think it was? What do you think the setting was like? We don't get the descriptions that we would get in a modern novel, but what do we think the setting was like? Okay, so we'll read again. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. And all the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, do not sin again." Okay, so for our third reading, for our third time through, here are the questions. Who or what are you, and what interests you? Now, as you go through, this is sort of what attracts you. You maybe think about a person or a thing, or consider yourself in that role. It's might not be specially mentioned in the printed story, but you sense or hear it as you read. What attracts you, right? Might attract you in this story that you're just interested in and want to explore deeper. Maybe an inanimate object, an animal, part of the scenery. Anything is open for interpretation here, right? Because we're going to, again, enter more and more into the story. So in this case, it's really almost picking out a character and saying, what are you doing as that character? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What is being done to you or with you if you're an inanimate object, right? What are the sounds and the smells and the other details about the location that you notice? What are the emotions and the undertones that you might notice? Right? So this is starting to really go from just outside observing the story into being a little bit more a part of the story, engaging. You've got some ideas about characters and people and things and different things going on in the text. We'll take a second, think about that, and then we'll read again. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" They said this to test him so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. They kept on questioning him. He straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Once again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, one by one, beginning with the elders, Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." We'll take a minute and reflect on what we were thinking just now with that part of the story. So for our fourth and final reading, choose, if you didn't choose one last time, definitely be sure to choose a specific person or an object. If you chose someone last time, or if your choice for the last story you didn't like, or you want to do it again for something different, that's fine. You can switch. Either is fine. The big point of this final time is to try to experience the full story as the person or object. Just completely immerse yourself as much as possible. What's the setting? What's happening to you? What's going on around you? Are you fearful? Are you excited? Are you worried? What's happening? When the reading ends, let the story continue to unfold within you. What happens after this story? Not in the text. We're not talking about the gospel. We're talking about what happens in the moments after this. With that person, with that object, with whatever's going on. We know that the story ends, but we don't know exactly what happens after. And allow your imagination to fill in some of those gaps. So we'll take a little bit longer. We'll take 2 or 3 minutes after this reading to just allow ourselves to continue to tell the story. Right? How does everything sort of shuffle away, or how do people end this tale? And in your use your imagination, your mind, and your heart until I say amen, and that'll be our conclusion of the prayer part of the story, okay? Last time. Early in the morning, Jesus came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And when they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, And from now on, do not sin again. So, as we leave the story and return to our current space and everything going on in our conversation, there's a handful of instructions. Each of us can take a couple minutes and share who or what they were in the story and what happened, what stuck out to you as you did this this form of Bible study, this Ignatian form of being in the text. And this is one of those things that may be profound. It may not be much of anything. It may be seem a little strange or silly, dramatic, or powerful. It could be any of these things. Whatever happens is what each person says. And there's literally no right or wrong answer. We're not searching for some deep or eternal truth. We're more seeking to be part of the story of God, and how do we engage in that, right? So with all that in mind, I'm going to actually make us all a little bit bigger. The other key is that we want to share our imagination and our prayer to wait. We'll wait until everyone has spoken, right? So it's we'll just let each person talk, and then we can sort of engage and talk about what we heard, or maybe it reminds one person telling a story reminds us of something else that we heard that we found unique, and we'll just have the conversation, talk about who or what you were and what happened. But the big thing I want to do, just since it's going to be us now talking, is make Who wants to start? Who wants to share who they were or what they thought when we did this little exercise?
You want me to go first?
Sure, Marcy, go for it. Be the brave one.
I'll be the icebreaker. So we did it 4 times, and I think on the 3rd time you asked us to be somebody in the story. Mm-hmm. So at first I was, I'm just part of the crowd. I'm watching all this unfold. And I've often thought growing up, hearing about things in the Bible, I was like, I'd like to be a fly on the wall and seeing this happen. I don't think I've ever wanted to live in those times, but because I like living in our modern times, but yes. I wanted to see it. So I thought of myself as in the crowd. But then like the 4th time we read it, I then sort of thought of myself as a time traveler, and I was in a drone and I was watching it all unfold, and I could zip down and see details. And so here's what I was thinking. I think that a couple of things jumped out at me. The passage talks about she was caught in the very act, of adultery. So that means whoever caught her, those scribes and Pharisees that brought her there, they had to know who the man was that was involved in or the other person that was involved in this area. And where was he or this other person? Where were they? And I'm not an expert on Moses' law, but that they referred to, but I think Leviticus or Deuteronomy or somewhere in there probably said that both people should be stoned. Or it should have said that if it didn't. But I was thinking, why are they not bringing the man in front of them? And then my mind wondered, well, maybe it's one of them, who knows? But I think too that when Jesus was writing in the dirt, so this is when I thought of the drone, I would want to zoom in and see, what did he write in the dirt? Was he writing Moses' law that said, both should be condemned? Or was he writing the man's name? Or was he, he had to be doing something very powerful that they could see. I think the writing is important, but we just don't know from the story. And then, so I think that written message, whatever it was. And then I thought it was interesting, they said the elders left first. So what about the elders? Maybe they knew the law better and they felt, sorry that they had tried to trick Jesus by only bringing the woman, not the man too. But so they sort of slinked away, and then the younger folks went after that. And the only other thing that jumped into my head is I like the message about, what Jesus said, the one without sin can throw the stone. That made me think about Paul in Romans that talks about there's none are righteous, no, not one. That just sort of interplayed to me. So that was how my mind wandered all over the place.
That's great.
That was really good.
All right, who's next?
No, that's what we kept wanting to know.
We wanted to know what he wrote.
Yeah, we
Two
kept.
different times he wrote something. What did he write? I mean, if it was such a statement that the elders got up and left, he wrote something powerful in the dirt.
Yeah. Well, and what he said
what
about
he
the
said.
woman. Yeah.
But it made me feel like here's an overriding message of the gospel, that even though she had broken the law of Moses, and like Marcy said, where's the guy here? Because he's an equal contributor to the act. I mean, it's not a one-man show or one-woman show. But to me, the fact that he said, I do not condemn you, and go and sin no more. I mean, to me, that's the whole message of the gospel. We're all imperfect. We all make boo-boos and do things we shouldn't do. But, this kind of really reflects to me the message of the gospel is that even though we're imperfect, we're going to make mistakes, but Jesus is going to help wipe that away and help us do better. That was mine.
Who were you? Were you any of those people?
I was probably standing on the sideline observing.
Yeah, that's what I felt like. Like Marcy said, I'd probably be one of the people that came to hear Jesus and kind of check him out, because it was all new. You heard about him and all the miracles he was doing, and you wanted to just learn more about him. And I felt like I would have been there for that. And then all at once, it got really exciting when they brought this poor woman up and said that she needed to be stoned. And
But I'm like, Marcy, I want to know what happened to the dude.
Yeah, where was that guy? I don't know. Maybe they didn't do anything to the guy. Maybe it was only the women that were stoned.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Roy, what do you have, my friend? How did this work with you?
Well, I wondered some of the same things that the others have mentioned. I wondered what Jesus wrote. And my mind sort of wondered, he's sitting in temple court. Is that a concrete floor, or is that dirt there? And so if it was a concrete floor, how is he writing something on a concrete floor?
Mm-hmm.
So I've wondered that. I sort of not necessarily identified with, but it mentioned you could be an inanimate object.
Mm-hmm.
I was the stone. I was the stone waiting there saying, okay, is somebody going to pick me up or not pick me up and throw it? And I don't feel good about this, about being thrown at this woman. So that's sort of what I thought too. That's pretty much it.
It's good one, Roy.
That is good.
Yeah, I like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, so I was leading, so I was looking at time and trying to engage in time, but I was thinking much the same. Especially that second time around where it's sort of talking about. I noticed it was in the morning. You know, that Jesus showed up in the morning, and so I had this idea that it was probably the cooler part of the day, like it is anywhere in the world, but especially in the desert, when overnight it can get pretty crisp, and so it was a cool morning. And so I was thinking about that, thinking about, like y'all said, the same ideas about, you know, where's the guy in this caught in the very act of adultery. And additionally, it's almost one of those, this is all a setup from those Pharisees and scribes who usually are on different sides. So you've got two people who usually agree, and it's sort of like the Republicans and the Democrats showed up to accuse him, and you go, oh, I don't know what you did, but it's not good when you got everybody's against you. And you almost get this idea of like, did they hire this woman to commit adultery or something? I mean, are they sort of plot? I mean, what level of plot upon plot was going on here, right? Did they follow someone they knew who was committing adultery and they all knew she was doing it and they just finally went and got her? Or him, but left him? I mean, there's so many of those sort of additional questions that I was starting to play with. And then the other side, actually I was in the same with you, Roy. I was sort of going, well, is he writing in the sort of, was it a paved floor and it was more writing in the dust on the floor, right? Just sort of moving around the dirt of the day, the sand of the day, or was he writing in the dirt? And what
did he say?
And I guess my final thing was really like, how did the people, and I didn't necessarily choose to do it, but I'm just curious to know how the people who had rocks in their hands already, right, that were all ready to do the stoning, how on earth they heard someone say, like, if you don't have sin, you can throw a stone, respond to be that challenge directly, right? Like, it's not, sometimes those things happen and go, you have no right, or they sort of make accusations, but it's much more like you're forced to do a self-examination on this stuff. And like, oh, if you don't have sin, you can throw a rock. And everybody just sort of sit there and go like, oh, I can't not do any of these things, right? Anytime anybody asks me to throw a stone, I can't do it now. I mean, that had to be a story that you definitely, and I could see those people, even the people who were maybe mad at Jesus and ready to, or mad at this one or both, left changed. I mean, in my mind, as we sort of spend that time afterwards, like what happens later, I can see a lot of those people, especially the ones who had rocks in their hands, going home going like, you won't believe what happened. I got to, I'm stuck. I thought I had it all figured out. And this guy gave me one sentence more or less. And now I'm doing everything. I'm rethinking it all.
Gave you something to think about.
It does. So again, that's we can all engage now with each other about any of it. I love the idea of the rock. That's great, Roy. That's fun.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, that is a good. Yeah.
But I mean, what's that?
I was just thought of another question while you were talking, Bill. That I mean, the scripture says that they did this to trick him. And so what was the trick? Was it because the Jews did not have a death penalty? I mean, I know they referred to Moses' law, which allowed stoning, but because the Roman government was in place, and remember, even when Jesus was crucified, it had to be the Roman government, not the Jews, because their law didn't allow it.
The most likely answer to that is that it was along those lines, that Jewish law has a lot of times you can put someone to death for all sorts of things, but you weren't supposed to do that unless you had the permission of Rome, right? Like it had to either go through a Jewish court and that's the other thing that's missing here, right? Like,
Right.
Jewish law is very clear. Like, even if they caught the woman in the very act, they still had to have a little bit of a trial and enough to say, like, well, what did she officially do? What's she accused of? I mean, maybe not quite Law and Order kind of merit or anything, but there was a degree of a hearing required before you automatically issued a judgment too. So all of this is sort of wrapped up into it, right? That, but I think the trick they were trying to get him with was, well, we've caught her in the very act. We know she did it. And therefore the law of Moses says you're supposed to put her to death. So are you going to put her to death and violate Roman law, or say that we should let her go and ignore Mosaic law, right? I think was the similar to what they do with the, which should you pay Caesar kind of question is the same kind of thing. You're not supposed to have certain things and back and forth, which, are you going to be a tax evader and throw off the evil of the empire, or a collaborator and pay Rome, was the question they were trying to catch him with on that side. Same. Yeah.
I wonder also who was actually going to be throwing the stones. Was it the Pharisees and the scribes? Was it the people that were there first with Jesus as he was teaching?
Mm-hmm.
Who would have been, and who would have said, okay, well, you group are going to throw the stones, so you go over here and you get ready, or something like that. So I wonder how that would have come about.
Yeah, there's lots of those questions.
Well, it makes me wonder, when they had these stonings, like you just said, did they have a trial? Did they, did they send out invitations? Come on down, we're having a stone throwing party, and bring your wine and cheese,
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, I don't understand that.
Yeah, was it more of an execution kind of group or whatever? That's the regular stoning committee? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean.
I don't know. It's not clear.
It's like in the Old West. Yeah, we're gonna have a necktie party. Come on down. Bring your picnic basket.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, where does
side of life?
Where does actual sort of legal justice come in, and where is mob justice involved here, right? Too.
But I didn't imagine a mob. It didn't seem to me that the crowd was in a frenzy. It seemed calm. I mean, especially how Jesus took time to be quiet and write in the dirt before he even said what he said. I don't think it had gotten to that point, or that's the way I imagined it as we went through this exercise.
Yeah.
And two, I thought it was interesting that the scribes and Pharisees called him teacher, a sign of respect when they walked up to him to ask him this question. Maybe it was sarcastic. I don't know, or if they really meant it.
But then they left.
Yeah, after he's, yeah. Interesting.
Anything else? Anything else to bring up? Like, this is just a fun way to engage the story a little differently, right? Instead of just purely doing the text criticism or source criticism and sort of analyzing it, trying to put our brains in the story and be there is just a different way to engage it. Ignatius had some fun exercises like this to help us engage the text and try.
I think it makes you think about the story on different levels in your own mind and help you understand more of the human reactions and what was going on.
Absolutely.
Not a sterile reading of sorts. I've never looked at it that way before, but it taught me a lot.
Well, hopefully it makes you a little more empathetic too for people in different parts of the story, right? If you're trying to see it through their eyes or through, you don't want to say I'm part of the crowd that's ready to stone somebody. We never say that, but we end up in those crowds sometimes anyway. How do we engage that? How do we try to be a calming force instead of just jumping into the to the angry mob?
It almost kind of makes you think of Scarlett and saying, well, I'll think about that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Be calm. Well, it was interesting.
Well, good.
So I just Googled about Deuteronomy, and it's Deuteronomy 22 or 2022. Hold on. It says, if a man is discovered lying with a woman who is married to another, they both shall die. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's already an issue, right?
so maybe part of what the Pharisees and scribes felt guilty for and walked away was that they were not following the very law they were trying to enforce. I mean, by only bringing a woman.
Yeah.
Very good point.
I like the idea of him writing. It's always a question, what did he write on the ground, and if that was part of it, or if it was just a distraction to calm the crowd. But I do like that idea of them even writing, whether he was writing down the name of the guy,
Yeah.
present, or just even writing down that verse, right? Like, the man and the woman shall be present or shall be put to death, right? Drawing out a little bit of that hypocrisy would be good. I like it.
Well, it doesn't tell you how big the crowd is. I mean, we're talking about 3 or 4 people or a dozen or.
Yeah.
Who knows?
How many people were in the temple? Yeah.
Hard to say. These are all those things that, again, it's just fun to engage the text this way and sort of ask the questions, but who knows?
Jesus must have been very intent on whatever he was writing on the ground, because it says that he bent down and then he got up and said, "Woman, where are they?" So it's like he was unaware that they had left. So even makes you more curious about what he was very intent on whatever he was writing, because he didn't realize everybody had left, I guess.
Well, were they close by or at a short distance?
Yeah, good point.
Right.
Yeah, no.
Well, I think while he was looking down, I'm pretty sure he knew no one was throwing a stone though.
Right.
And didn't he say the similar phrase to the woman at the well, go and sin no more?
No more.
Or am
Yeah.
I confusing that?
He says that a lot. There's a lot
Okay.
when he says that. You never see Jesus condemning someone for whatever sin they have done, but he definitely seems to say, like, okay, you're forgiven, but don't do it again. Try not to do it again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go and sin no more is definitely part of that. So,
Yeah. So.
which is how I sure hope it works.
Yeah.
Come whenever we make it to the other side. Glad you're here. Not here's the list of all the things you did wrong, and let's talk about all of them. Well, good to be with you, my friends. Again, this was just a great way. I enjoy doing this from time to time. It's a nice way, especially when you have a good story like this, to engage the text and hear it a little differently. So
Thank you.
we'll look ahead to that's more discourse. So I'm going to try and figure out a way to unpack some of that for us, because that gets much more confusing. But it's when Jesus is saying, "I am the light of the world." It's the second half of chapter 8, or actually the last 2/3, 3/4 of chapter 8. So we'll look at that next time. All
All
right.
right. Good to see everybody.
Yeah.
Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.